"Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move to coach the flight attendant," said her voice shaking. Leonard Hayes looked up calmly from seat 3A, held out his boarding pass, and asked one word. "Why?" A moment later, the cockpit door opened, and the captain stepped out, walking straight toward them, and raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. "Hi, everyone. Today we're starting with a moment that's quiet, too quiet. A man sits in a first-class seat with a boarding pass in hand, and yet someone still tries to make him move. Why? Because he didn't look like he belonged. But what happened next silenced the entire cabin and the entire internet. This could happen to anyone, even you. So before we dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Drop it in the comments. Now, let me tell you a story about dignity power and how one quiet man showed the world what real respect looks like. The airport buzzed with its usual early morning rhythm, rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, coffee lids snapping shut. Nashville International's Terminal B carried that hum of travel anxiety and tired routine. But standing in the middle of it all, still as stone, was a man who didn't seem in any hurry. Leonard Hayes didn't move fast these days, not because he couldn't, but because he'd long since learned that most of life wasn't worth rushing through. At 79, the retired Navy mechanic had been through enough sunrises, surgeries, storms, and soul-searching to know that steady beats loud every time. He wore a short-sleeved button-up shirt pressed the night before navy blue slacks and loafers, so polished they caught a sliver of overhead light. His hands dry and calloused from decades of work clutched a worn duffel in one hand and a first-class boarding pass in the other. Seat 3A, window. Leonard glanced at it again before tucking it back into his shirt pocket. He didn't normally fly first class. Didn't normally fly at all, to be honest. But this trip, this one mattered. Naomi, his great-granddaughter, was starring in her third-grade play back in Charleston. She'd called him a week earlier, with the news voice full of delight and no clue what it meant for him to be there. "Great-grandpop, I'm playing the mayor." "You gotta come. I get to wear a big fake hat and everything." So his veterans group at church had pitched in, bought him the ticket, first class, said a man like him deserved to ride up front for once. He'd laughed when they handed it over, but promised he'd wear his best. And he had. At the gate, Leonard waited quietly until the first-class call rang out. He stepped forward with the smallest of nods to the young couple beside him, then made his way onto the plane. The moment he crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. Quieter, more hushed. Leather seats, stainless steel trim, the kind of air that smelled like citrus wipes in efficiency. Leonard found his seat. 3A, window, the one Naomi said was the best spot to wave from. He lifted his duffel with careful effort and tucked it gently into the overhead bin. Then he sat down slow, mindful of the stiffness in his left knee. Outside the window, he watched the carts move across the tarmac and smiled. The sound of a fuel truck reversing reminded him of long days on aircraft carriers back when his hair was still black and his back didn't argue with him every time he stood up. That's when he heard the voice. "Excuse me?" Leonard turned. The woman standing there looked polished to the point of perfection. Cream blazer, skinny jeans, pointed heels that didn't seem meant for airports. She held a tan designer carry-on in one hand and pointed toward the seat he was in with the other. "I believe you're in my seat," she said flatly. Leonard blinked. Then he gave a small smile. 3A. "Yes," she said, her tone clipped. "I always fly window in first. Always." Leonard reached into his pocket, pulled out the boarding pass, and held it out. "Says 3A. She didn't take it. Didn't even look at it. Just scanned him. Shirt, hands, shoes, eyes. That long pause where someone sizes you up, not for who you are, but who they think you should be." Her smile turned tight. "No offense, but are you sure you're supposed to be up here?" The words weren't loud, but they were sharp. They cut with that same jagged edge Leonard had heard 1,000 times before in his life, just dressed in new clothes. "I believe I am," he said calmly, eyes steady. She shifted her weight onto one hip. "Maybe they made a mistake. It happens sometimes. I'm sure we can just get a flight attendant and fix it." Leonard didn't argue. He just kept looking out the window like the carts out there were more interesting than whatever was unfolding beside him. But others were watching now. The man across the aisle peeked over his glasses. A teenager in 2C glanced up from his phone. The silence began to stretch. The woman raised a hand and waved down the nearest flight attendant, a young brunette with a clipboard tucked to her side and a smile that looked 3 shifts too tired. "Hi there," the woman began sweetly. "There seems to be some confusion with the seating." "He's in my seat." The flight attendant turned to Leonard. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" He handed it over without a word. She scanned it. Then again. Her eyes flicked to the placard above the seat. Then to the woman. Then back to Leonard. It does say 3A. The woman didn't move. "Well, that's not right. I know my assistant booked 3A. I've flown this route twice a month for years." The attendant's smile faltered. "Would you mind if I checked with the gate?" Before Leonard could answer, she added, "Sir, would you mind just stepping back to coach for a moment? Just while we sort this out." Leonard turned to her fully. "No," he said gently. "Just until." "No," he repeated. Then quieter. "That won't be necessary." The plane had gone still. You could almost hear the brakes on the catering truck outside. "Sir, I showed you my boarding pass," Leonard said. "It's valid. There's nothing to sort out." The attendant froze. The woman beside them exhaled loudly, her foot tapping now. "I cannot believe this," she muttered. But no one else spoke. Not yet. They just watched. And then from the front of the plane, the cockpit door opened. The sound of the cockpit door clicking open felt louder than it should have. Not dramatic, not staged, just purposeful. Steady footfalls followed, slow and deliberate. Every person in first class seemed to instinctively sit a little straighter, as though the air itself had shifted. Captain Drew Coleman stepped into the cabin. Tall, mid-40s and built like someone who still woke up at 5 a.m. out of habit. His uniform was sharp, his walk confident, but not showy. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. It followed him like a shadow. He looked first at the flight attendant, who turned toward him with a nervous twitch in her smile. "There's been a seating issue, sir," she said quickly. "I was just about to—" "Let me see the passes," the captain said, calm and cool. Leonard handed his over without hesitation. Captain Coleman took it, glanced at it once, then again, then turned to the woman. "May I see yours as well, ma'am?" Her lips parted like she might argue, but then she sighed and dug into her carry-on. Out came a boarding pass, glossy and folded neatly. Captain Coleman took it, read it silently, then looked up. His voice didn't change, but there was an edge, now a clarity. "Ma'am, you're in seat 6C. Aisle. Coach." The woman blinked. "No. That can't be right. There's no way I've seen thousands of these passes," he said smoothly. "It's correct. We can call the gate if you'd like to confirm, but this one here," he held up Leonard's. "This one is 3A. First class." She looked around the cabin, hoping for anyone to back her up. But the silence had weight now. Even the man with the newspaper had lowered it completely. Nobody was on her side. The captain didn't scold. He didn't shame. He just turned slightly, eyes falling on Leonard again. Then to everyone's surprise, he stood at full attention and saluted. It wasn't performative. It wasn't dramatic. It was clean, measured, and sincere. The kind of salute you give when you recognize something bigger than protocol. "You served?" the captain asked softly. Leonard hesitated. Then he nodded. "Navy," he said. "Mechanic." "Long time ago." "I thought so," the captain replied. "That patch on your bag, it's nearly worn through, but I recognized it. USS Independence. My grandfather used to talk about the men on that ship. Said they kept the sky running." Leonard gave a slow smile. "Well, we tried." The plane stayed quiet, but now it wasn't tension. It was respect. A ripple of awe moved through the rows. The flight attendant looked down, her face flushed. The woman, Vanessa, stood frozen, eyes darting between the captain and Leonard. The captain lowered his salute and addressed the woman with finality. "You'll need to take your assigned seat, ma'am." She opened her mouth, then closed it. She grabbed her carry-on, turned without a word, and walked back toward coach. Her heels tapped too loudly against the floor, as if even the plane was rejecting the sound of her exit. The captain looked once more at Leonard. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "can I get you anything?" "A drink, maybe, something to make this trip easier." Leonard shook his head. "I'm fine. Thank you, Captain." He returned to his window, view unbothered. Still, But not everyone had moved on. Back in coach, a man in his 30s pulled out his phone and hit record. The tail end of the salute, the woman's retreat, and the silent strength of Leonard sitting in 3A, it all fit neatly into the frame. "That's real," he whispered to his seatmate. She was already recording too. A few rows behind them, someone with a laptop had started typing. Her headline read, "Veteran told to move from first class. Captain steps in." None of that reached Leonard. His flip phone stayed in his pocket. He didn't know the story had already left the plane. He pulled out the folded paper Naomi had mailed him last week, her school's play flyer, decorated with crayon stars and a photo of her in a cardboard top hat. He smiled. That's why he was here. Not for a seat. Not for a salute. For her. The flight attendant returned with a bottle of water and a softer expression. "Here you go, Mr. Hayes," she said. He nodded. "Thank you." She hesitated. I'm sorry. For before. Leonard looked up at her steady. "You were trying to keep the peace," he said. "But sometimes peace doesn't come from asking the wrong man to move." She didn't reply, just nodded and walked away. 30 minutes later, somewhere above the Appalachian foothills, the internet started doing what it does best: multiply. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, the video had over 8,000 views. And one of those belonged to a woman sitting at her kitchen table outside Memphis, Tennessee. Her name was Simone Hayes, mid-50s, dreadlocks twisted back in a loose bun, a t-shirt that said "Good Trouble" across the front. A chipped mug of coffee sat forgotten next to her. She stared at her phone thumb hovering over the screen. The man in the video, sitting calm, saying little, just holding his ground, that was her father. She hadn't seen him in 15 years. Not since the argument. Not since she'd packed a suitcase and said, "You don't get to choose what kind of woman I am." She had never called, never visited. But here he was, not asking for anything, just being. The words he spoke to the flight attendant echoed in her head. Sometimes peace doesn't come from asking the wrong man to move. She hit play again, watched the salute, her breath caught. And then she was in her car. No hesitation. Just the GPS lit up on her dash and the hum of tires on the interstate. The descent into Charleston was smooth. A few light bumps, nothing dramatic. Leonard barely noticed. His eyes stayed on the clouds outside, soft and endless, like someone had stretched a blanket across the sky. He wasn't thinking about the woman in 6C. He wasn't thinking about the captain's salute or the flight attendant's apology. He was thinking about the stage Naomi would stand on, the one where she'd say her one line and beam with pride, knowing someone who loved her was watching from the front row. But 2 rows behind him, the world was already catching up to what had happened. The man who'd recorded the video, sleeves rolled up, baseball cap pushed back, was scrolling through comments. Hundreds of them. Then thousands. That man's composure was something else. "We need more leaders like that pilot. This is why you don't judge people by their clothes." One comment pinned to the top read, "Respect isn't loud, but you feel it when it walks into the room." The man grinned, nudged his girlfriend, and said, "They're calling him Mr. Hayes like he's everyone's grandpa." By the time the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the video had reached nearly 50,000 views. In Charleston's arrivals area, Simone Hayes waited by baggage claim. She hadn't told anyone she was coming, hadn't even brought a bag, just a purse, her car keys, and the flyer Naomi had mailed to Leonard, the one she'd stolen from her daughter's backpack that morning before leaving. She had stared at that flyer for an hour, then driven across 2 states without even packing a toothbrush. When she saw him come down the escalator, duffel on his shoulder, moving slow but proud, it hit her like a wave. The gray in his hair, the way his posture leaned just slightly to the left now, the lines deeper in his cheeks. But his walk still solid, still his. Leonard looked up, caught her eyes across the terminal. He slowed, not stopped, not startled, just quiet. Simone stayed still, then said, "Hi, Pop." Leonard blinked once. "Hi, Simone." That was it. They stood 5 feet apart, separated by 15 years of silence and one very public video. She reached into her purse, pulled out the flyer, and held it up. "Thought maybe you'd want a ride." Leonard nodded. "That'd be nice." They didn't hug, didn't cry. They just turned toward the exit together, step by step, walking in rhythm they didn't realize they still shared. Outside, the sky had turned a soft gold. Charleston's humidity hung low, not heavy, just present. They got into her car, an old Toyota with one missing hubcap, and drove in silence for a few miles before Simone spoke again. I saw the video, she said. Leonard nodded. I didn't recognize you at first, but the way you sat there, the way you didn't even flinch. Leonard gave a short breath somewhere between a sigh and a chuckle. Wasn't trying to prove anything, he said. Just tired of being moved. Simone looked straight ahead. I get that now. They pulled into the school parking lot just as the sun dipped below the tree line. Shiloh Elementary looked like any small-town school, brick walls, faded murals, kids running around the flagpole like it was a racetrack. Naomi was backstage with her classmates, oblivious to everything but the fact that her big moment was coming. She peeked out once and saw her mother and great-grandfather in the front row. Her smile nearly cracked her paper mustache. The lights dimmed. The stage lit up, and Naomi stepped forward with her little felt sash, fake top hat, and a voice that rang out proud and clear. Welcome to our town, where everyone has a place. Leonard clapped louder than anyone else. Just a little. Just enough. And beside him, Simone was already crying quiet tears. Not because of the line, but because he had come. Because she had come. Because sometimes healing doesn't need a speech. Just a seat beside someone you love. After the play, kids ran around the auditorium like confetti had burst in the air. Parents took photos. Teachers collected props. Naomi sprinted toward Leonard with arms wide. He knelt just enough to meet her hug halfway. You came, she squealed. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Simone stood a few feet away watching them. Her phone buzzed. A coworker had texted her. Isn't this your dad? Attached was a screenshot of the video. The captain saluting. Leonard looking out the window. The title, veteran told he doesn't belong in first class, pilot's response goes viral. Simone didn't respond. She slipped the phone back into her purse and looked at Leonard. He was holding Naomi's hand. She was dragging him toward the refreshment table, jabbering about juice boxes and cookies. And he was smiling more than she remembered, or maybe more than she'd let herself remember. The crowd moved around them, but Leonard stood still. He always did, not because the world told him to, but because he had long since learned that dignity doesn't ask for space. It commands it. This time, though, he answered. Mr. Hayes, a voice asked. Female, warm, formal. This is Deborah Langston. I'm the director of the South Carolina Veterans Honor Council. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all, Leonard said. We saw the video. More importantly, we saw the grace in it. We were wondering if you'd be willing to speak at our Veterans Day event this fall. Not as a hero, not even as a vet, just as a man who reminded people what respect looks like. Leonard didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the road, thought about Naomi, about Simone, and about the captain's voice on his voicemail, about the woman who saw him but didn't see him. I'm not much for speeches, he said. We don't need a speech, Deborah replied. We just need you to sit in the front row. Leonard chuckled. That I can do. As the call ended, Simone's car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out, heels in hand, looking exhausted. Staff meeting with no coffee, she groaned. I barely survived, Leonard stood. There's still some left. Might be a bit strong, she smiled. You always made it like motor oil. They went inside, and as Simone poured herself a cup, her phone buzzed again. She turned it over. A new email with the subject, media request, Seat 3A documentary in development. She looked up. You want to be part of something like this? Leonard shrugged. Only if they let me keep my seat. Later that evening, they walked together down the street, Simone holding Naomi's hand, Leonard walking a step behind, watching. As they crossed the small park near the school, a teenager on a bench looked up from his phone and did a double take. Are you that guy from the plane? He asked. Leonard smiled but didn't answer. Naomi beamed. That's my great-grandpop. He's famous now. The teen nodded. You were real cool, sir. Like, quiet, strong. My pops showed me the video. Leonard tipped his head. Appreciate that. They kept walking, but the moment lingered. Because it wasn't about fame. It wasn't about going viral. It was about showing a generation raised on volume that stillness could carry more power than noise. That sometimes the most commanding thing you can do in a world full of shouting is not move. And as the sun dipped behind the trees, and the shadows stretched long across the sidewalk. Leonard Hayes knew something that would never go away. He hadn't just held his ground. He'd held open a door for his family, for strangers, for anyone watching who needed a reminder that worth isn't worn on your sleeve. It's lived in your bones, in how you carry yourself when nobody believes you should be where you are, and in how you stay seated until the whole room remembers to stand. Sometimes justice doesn't come with a gavel. It doesn't arrive with noise or applause or a viral headline. Sometimes it looks like a man who refuses to give up his seat not out of anger, not out of pride, but because dignity told him he didn't have to. Leonard Hayes never asked for attention. He didn't demand anything. All he did was stay where he knew he belonged, and in doing so he reminded the rest of us what strength really looks like. Not the kind that yells, not the kind that shoves, but the kind that waits, that watches, that endures. We live in a time where people are quick to judge based on appearances and quicker still to speak without listening. But Leonard showed us that real power isn't always loud, it's consistent, quiet, resilient. Maybe today we can all learn something from Seat 3A. Maybe the next time you feel unseen or dismissed or disrespected, you won't have to shout. Maybe you'll just stay right where you are, still, calm, unshaken. Because when you carry yourself with quiet conviction, even the world's noise begins to fade, and people start to see what they were missing all along. And who knows? You might even find that someone who walked away 15 years ago is finally ready to come sit beside you. So hold your ground, speak with your life, and never forget sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just sit still.